The thing that Andrew and I will be presenting today is on methods and the scope of disciplines. So first off, I'll be talking a bit about like the theoretical background and where we got this topic, everything that we've kind of done so far on the Scientonomic end. And then Andrew's going to be going through a bit about some of the case studies that we're working on and trying to exactly prove these pretty big contentions that we're making. And we've had a lot of discussions and arguments about, but all in good fun, of course. So to start off, this was briefly introduced in Nora's presentation, but we're working with a definition of scope here that we kind of got from Paul and Cyrus's paper on disciplines. So the definition of scope, as she mentioned, is the discipline set of core questions, accepted sub-questions of the core questions, and theories that answer the core questions or accepted sub-questions. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I've kind of put all of the relevant definitions for everything here that we've gone through. So a core question, as Izzy was discussing, is a question identified in the discipline's delineating theory as definitive of the discipline. Then we have a sub-question, where a question Q is a sub-question of another question Q prime, if and only if any direct answer to Q is also a partial answer to that should be a Q prime, so sorry about that. The law of question acceptance, as Nikki had mentioned in her presentation, was that a question becomes accepted only if all of its epistemic presuppositions are accepted, and it is accepted that the question is answerable. And then finally, our basic definition for a theory is just a set of propositions. So that's kind of all of the relevant definitions that you need to understand this definition of scope. But really where we're starting off this presentation is what kind of epistemic elements are relevant to the scope of a discipline. And we kind of get a lot of questions from this definition. So why only accepted sub-questions is the first one that we think about. So in Patton and Al-Zayati paper, they give the example of evolutionary biology. So a core question of evolutionary biology is, how did living species originate as a result of evolution? Now, we can pretty clearly frame two sub-questions of this, where how did living species originate as a result of evolution via natural selection, and how did living species originate as a result of evolution caused by intelligent design? Now, we can pretty clearly see that the first of these questions is acceptable within the scope of evolutionary biology, whereas the second is pretty much accepted to be not within the scope of evolutionary biology. And the reason for this is because the first is accepted while the second one isn't. We have this epistemic presupposition that there is some kind of intelligent designer, and obviously that isn't accepted, so the question is outside of the scope. This is where we're starting with the definition of scope for our paper. However, what Andrew and I want to talk about is, why are there only questions and theories within the definition of a scope? We want to argue that there is going to be a method involved there as well. So we talked to Paul about this, we've had a few discussions, and we both agree that there needs to be some kind of method, but we kind of disagree a bit in its nature. So we put together a bit of an argument from the second law of theory acceptance, which is that if a theory satisfies the acceptance criteria of the method employed at the time, it becomes accepted into the mosaic. If it does not, it remains unaccepted. And if the assessment is inconclusive, the theory can be accepted or not accepted. We start with this. We add the definition that Izzy went over about a delineating theory being a second-order theory identifying the set of core questions in a discipline. And we arrive at the conclusion that there needs to be a method of the discipline that can assess the delineating theory. So far, all good, we agree on this. Now, the difference is what this method exactly is. From Patton and Al-Zayati, what we get is that this method is simple and it's fixed. A sub-question is within the scope of a discipline if it is accepted. And that goes through all of time, goes through every single case study that we talk about. And this model here can kind of be applied to sub-questions as well as theories within the discipline. We can go from the second law and the existence of some kind of method that is necessary. However, most of the questions that we work, or most of the methods that we work with do change over time. And so what Andrew and I are asking here is there a method beyond this? Is it not just acceptance, but perhaps something more? So our first instinct to look for in this kind of quest for finding other methods involved in determining which questions are within the scope of a discipline was to look at unaccepted disciplines. So if we look at something like astrology, we start with the premise that astrology is a discipline scope contains its core questions, and we arrive at the conclusion that the scope of astrology contains the core questions of astrology. Then we add on that the core questions of astrology are not currently accepted, and we get that the questions do not need to be accepted in order for them to be in the scope of a discipline. Now, this was where we started, and we thought we had a case here. We thought it was pretty clear and straightforward that we have questions that are not accepted within the scope of discipline. But unfortunately, the argument isn't so simple. After a discussion with Paul, we were reminded of the existence of this idea of community-based acceptance, where he told us that there's some kind of authority delegation going on here, where it's not just the general scientific community that needs to accept it, but rather the community that practices that specific discipline. So we have a delineating method, which as part of the disciplinary community X, that says that a question is within the scope of a discipline X if it is a core question of the accepted discipline, as indicated in the discipline's delineating theory, or an accepted subquestion of a core question. And then any other epistemic agent who may not be a part of that disciplinary community uses a delegated delineating method that says that a question is within the scope of a discipline X if it is considered to be within the scope of discipline X by that disciplinary community. So this is how we account for the scope of a discipline that is not accepted by the broad scientific community today, such as astrology or alchemy. Now, once again, we get to a point where we're like, oh yeah, maybe acceptance does work, but what else could it possibly be? Is there any way to possibly include methods that are not just pure acceptance? So what we're looking for in a case study to try and see if there is a method that is not just acceptance is a few small things. So let's say we have some community X that is the disciplinary community D. So the community analyzing what is in the scope of the discipline is also the community that practices that discipline. So community X then relies on a delineating method that does not rely on question acceptance to evaluate the scope of its discipline. And community X can still determine the scope of its own discipline by filtering out the subquestions without relying on acceptance, for example, by considering an unaccepted question Q to be within the scope of D. This is what we would need in a case study in order to go against the idea that it's purely acceptance. Now, another way to show this is if we can find a discipline D such that community X accepts D's delineating theory, community X is the disciplinary community accepting D, and then community X can still determine the scope of D by filtering out the subquestions without relying on acceptance. So we don't necessarily need community X and community D to be the same thing. What we really are looking for is something where we accept the delineating theory and we're not seeing any kind of authority delegation going on here. So we arrive at two possible cases for a case study that could possibly disprove this, the first being an unaccepted question within the scope, and the second being an accepted question outside of the scope. So if we're able to find a case study that demonstrates one of these two, then we can show that it isn't necessarily just acceptance that is delineating what is a part of the scope, and thus we can have a delineating method that is not fixed and not the same all throughout time. So I'll pass it over to Andrew here, who's going to talk a bit about one of the case studies that we've discovered so far.
Yeah, I will discuss about this case study of puerperal fever. It's just another word for childbed fever. Is my voice loud enough? Just want to make sure. Okay, and I know we're pressed on time, so I'll try to be as quick and concise as possible. So what we see here is just a brief description of what childbed fever is. So childbed fever is a disease that causes shivering, intense abdominal pain, and fever to women who recently gave birth. And I wanted to clarify what my diagram is supposed to represent. So the entire box is supposed to represent the scope of obstetrics from the perspective of the main community in the United States. And this border with where I'm indicating is any question inside the border is considered within the scope. And any shaded border represents accepted questions and theories. For this case study, we want to dissect how we think there are questions that are within the scope but not accepted. And so the main question the physicians were trying to tackle, which was what is causing childbed fever. And we realized soon this was actually a very complex problem because physicians use all sorts of they use the same word, infection, contagion, but they all meant kind of different things. So it was a bit confusing, but this is the best simple way we can kind of have so far. So the main accepted idea was that childbed fever was caused by a certain proneness or a certain disposition that since after you're giving birth, you're a bit, the woman is a bit ill. That was the sort of main idea fostered by the community, and that poses a question, which is what causes the proneness of childbed fever. And another prominent view that was actually not, which was actually really discouraged, which was that childbed fever was caused by some sort of putrid material. So putrid stands for something that is dead, inorganic, some sort of material that you can actually observe. And so there's another posing question, which was what causes the transmission of this kind of material in childbed fever. So for this case study, we're trying to provide really clear evidence that this question was unaccepted, but still within the scope of the discipline. But we're realizing this is actually really difficult, but we're going to work on making this as clear as possible. So here are some quotes so far to describe this kind of case study. So these quotes, the first one, I know it's going to be big, but it's just to describe the prominent view of what causes childbed fever. I'm not going to read out the entire thing, but basically it's saying that childbed fever is just caused by a certain disposition. It's just to provide evidence for that. And the second one is just to describe what contagion means, or what they thought that contagion has to rely on some sort of material that's being caused or that's being produced by the person and within the person. And this quote is showing, I'm not going to read it out loud, but basically two key points that we want to highlight is one is that the person providing the quote is suggesting that the idea of this putrid material is causing the childbed fever. He still respects that this question is within the scope as because he says that this is being advocated by many of his brethren, or in other words, someone within his discipline, but yet he still doesn't accept this question or this theory. And so the big thing I'm still working on is finding a clear indicator that not only he doesn't accept the presuppositions, but also that he really doesn't accept the question as well. But we're really hoping to make this more clear. But otherwise, the main focus is that we're trying to use this case study to show that there is an unaccepted question, yet is still within the scope of the discipline. Yeah, and so thank you so much.
Questions? Paul?
So if you have a delineating method, if you want to talk about delineating methods that are used to assess a delineating theory for a discipline, it seems to me you sort of have a chicken and egg problem, because the community is not a disciplinary community until after you already have a delineating theory that defines the discipline, okay? So what community is it that assesses the delineating theory in the first place? Because until after that theory has already been assessed, there is no discipline, so you can't talk of a disciplinary community until you have an accepted discipline.
I'm trying to like piece together how this would all work. I think if your like definition of discipline is solely based on the delineating theory and the core questions, then yes, you have that problem. I think what we're trying to argue is that you also need a delineating method. Not like, yes, it assesses the delineating theory and thus the core questions, but it also tells us which kind of questions or which kind of sub-questions would be within the scope of the discipline. So it's saying more than just assessing the delineating theory, but also those sub-questions, if that makes sense.
But who is it that accepts the delineating method, and who is it that employs the delineating method to decide that there's a discipline, if not the disciplinary community? And this disciplinary community doesn't exist until after you already have an accepted discipline. You maybe need some way of talking about how you need something else besides the existing elements to talk about a discipline in order to get out of the chicken and egg problem. I don't know exactly how to do it, but
yeah, I'm not too sure about that. I would have to think more on that and try and figure out for the delineating theory. But I think even when you have that disciplinary community that's already established, they are going to need to say which questions are within the scope after the disciplinary community is established, and thus would still rely on that kind of method to determine which sub-questions are within the scope.
If I may add something to that quickly, I think if we are to succeed in finding situations where there is more to delineation than just a fixed method, the way Paul thinks of it, then I think we have much better chance of looking at disciplines that are announced by a certain community and that community does not accept it. So by focusing on situations when there's clearly a delineating theory for a discipline, but the community does not. For instance, one thing that comes to mind is the 18th century encyclopedia in that big chart of the system of knowledge that D'Alembert drew, that big chart that you probably know what I'm talking about. Among many disciplines that they separate, they also include things that they themselves clearly do not accept. Like there's magie noire, black magic, there is judicial astrology that they don't accept, but they clearly have a delineating theory for those. Maybe looking at those kind of situations when you have this big community that has a delineating theory for an unaccepted discipline, and I don't think they're delegated to anyone. So, but then Paul might always have a case by saying, no, they're delegating to whatever agents actually first practiced it. So we should try and find those kind of disciplines or sub-disciplines that probably even never been accepted. The judicial astrology might serve as a good case. Because the whole point of defining this judicial astrology was specifically to say that, no, we don't accept it. Maybe that's...
Okay, so easy.
Going back to the chicken and egg problem a little bit. Oh, can you hear me? My thing is being kind of funny. Okay, excellent. I wonder if somewhere good to look would be like appointments of professors in university departments or the inception of university departments, because if that's an external acknowledgement of who is in the discipline or what scientists pursuing what questions can be considered to be working in the discipline. And additionally, university departments, I mean, at least I found with my research, they would sometimes dissuade pursuing alchemical questions, even though those questions were still in the scope of chemistry at that time. So I wonder if you're looking for indicators, if like university departments and hiring would be a good place to start.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I will definitely do that and talk to you more about alchemy after this.
Okay, so if we have no more questions, thank you so much, Rebecca and Andrew.